The text message arrived at 2:47 p.m., just as the pastor was reading the final prayer over my son's casket. "Mom, I'm alive, but if you tell anyone, we're both dead." I was holding Daniel's phone in my trembling hands, the same phone the police had returned to me with his personal effects, when this impossible message appeared on the screen. What I discovered about why my 32-year-old son had to fake his own death led me into a world of corruption, betrayal, and danger that I never knew existed, and the investigation that followed nearly cost me my life. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. At 70 years old, I thought I'd weathered every storm life could throw at me. My name is Meredith Blackwood, and I've spent my entire 7 decades in the mountain town of Willowbrook, Montana, population 3,847. The town sits nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are harder to keep than anywhere else in the world, or so I thought. I live in the same log cabin my late husband Theodore and I built with our own hands 45 years ago, back when we were young and foolish enough to think we could carve out a perfect life in the wilderness. The cabin sits on 12 acres of pine forest and wildflower meadows, with a view of Granite Peak that takes your breath away every sunrise. Theodore passed 5 years ago from a stroke, leaving me alone in our mountain sanctuary with nothing but memories and the wildlife that wandered through my property like old friends. We raised 4 children in this house, watching them grow from toddlers who chased fireflies in our meadow to adults with their own complicated lives scattered across the country. My eldest, Victoria, became a forest ranger and moved to Yellowstone. Marcus followed his father's footsteps into carpentry and settled in Billings with his wife and 3 kids. Isabella married a rancher and lives just outside of Bozeman, close enough to visit but far enough to have her own life. And then there was Daniel, my baby, my youngest, at 32, and the one who could never quite find where he belonged in this world. Daniel was different from his siblings from the day he was born. While the others were content to explore the mountains, build tree forts, and live the simple life that Willowbrook offered, Daniel was fascinated by technology. By age 10, he was taking apart every electronic device in our house and somehow managing to put them back together better than before. When other kids were playing outside, Daniel was hunched over a computer, learning programming languages and hacking into systems just to see if he could. He was brilliant. The kind of brilliant that made his teachers shake their heads in amazement and worry in equal measure. Daniel graduated valedictorian from Willowbrook High School and earned a full scholarship to Montana State University, where he studied computer science and cybersecurity. While his classmates were partying and figuring out their majors, Daniel was already working part-time for tech companies, solving problems that stumped engineers with decades of experience. After college, Daniel moved back to Willowbrook, much to everyone's surprise. Most young people couldn't wait to escape our small town for the bright lights of bigger cities, but Daniel said he preferred the quiet. He rented a small apartment above Henley's hardware store on Main Street and started working remotely for various tech companies, specializing in cybersecurity and digital forensics. The work paid extremely well enough that Daniel could afford to live comfortably in our low-cost town while saving most of his income. He drove a modest Subaru Outback, dressed in flannel shirts and hiking boots like everyone else in Willowbrook, and spent his free time either visiting me at the cabin or hiking the mountain trails with his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, claiming he did his best thinking in nature. Daniel never married, though it wasn't for lack of interest from the few single women in town. He always said he was too busy with work to focus on relationships, but I suspected the real reason was that he'd never found anyone who understood his complex mind. He was gentle and kind, quick to help elderly neighbors with their computer problems or teach kids at the library how to code. But there was always something guarded about him, as if he carried secrets too heavy for casual conversation. For the past 3 years, Daniel had been working primarily for one company, Prometheus Digital Solutions, a cybersecurity firm based in Denver that specialized in protecting government databases and corporate networks. The work was classified, Daniel always told me, which meant he couldn't discuss details, even with family. When I asked what he did all day, he'd just smile and say he was keeping the bad guys out of places they don't belong. The money from Prometheus was good. Good enough that Daniel had started talking about buying land outside town and building his own house. He'd even shown me architectural plans he'd been sketching, a modern cabin that would blend technology with the natural beauty of our mountain setting. We'd spent hours discussing where on the property he might build, whether to include solar panels, how to design the workspace where he could continue his cybersecurity work while living closer to the family he loved. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. Daniel had come to Sunday dinner as he did every week, bringing his usual contribution of store-bought pie from Martha's Bakery and his ever-present laptop bag. But something was different that evening. My son, who normally talked excitedly about his hiking adventures and the wildlife he had photographed during his mountain excursions, was quiet and distracted.
"Danny, you feeling all right?" I asked, using the childhood nickname that always made him smile. "I'm fine, Mom. Just work stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." But I knew my son, and this wasn't his normal work stress. Daniel had always been calm under pressure, the type of person who solved problems methodically and rarely let anything rattle him. This was different. He kept glancing out the windows of our cabin, checking his phone every few minutes, and barely touched the venison stew that was usually his favorite meal. "Are you having trouble with the project?" I pressed gently. "Something like that." He set down his fork and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." If something ever happened to me, something sudden, would you promise me not to trust anyone who claims they're trying to help you? Not the police, not federal agents, not even people from my company. Promise me you'd be careful? The request sent a chill down my spine. "Daniel, what kind of trouble are you in?" "I'm not in trouble, exactly. It's just the work I do, sometimes people don't like what I find. I want to make sure you're protected if anything ever happens." I studied my youngest child's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his water glass. "Son, if you're in danger, we need to call someone. The sheriff or—" "No." Daniel's response was so sharp that it startled both of us. "Mom, promise me, no police, no outside help. If something happens, just lay low and don't trust anyone until you know the whole truth." I promised him what he wanted to hear, chalking up his paranoia to the stress of working in cybersecurity. Daniel had always been prone to conspiracy theories about government surveillance and corporate espionage, occupational hazards of spending his days protecting against digital threats. I figured he'd been working too hard and needed a vacation. When he left that night, Daniel hugged me longer than usual and told me he loved me 3 times before getting in his car. Standing on my porch, watching his taillights disappear down the mountain road, I had the strangest feeling that something was ending, though I couldn't have imagined what. 6 days later, Daniel was dead. The phone rang at 5:43 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in late September. I was already awake, sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint Granite Peak in shades of gold and pink. The early morning call could only mean one thing: bad news. Sheriff Wade Patterson was on the line, his familiar gravelly voice careful and controlled in the way that law enforcement officers learn to deliver life-altering information. "Meredith, I'm real sorry to be calling you this early, but there's been an accident. It's about Daniel." The coffee mug slipped from my hands and shattered on the wooden porch. "What kind of accident?" "Single vehicle crash on Highway 89, about 15 miles north of town. Daniel's car went off the road sometime last night. We found him this morning when a trucker spotted the wreckage down in Bear Creek Canyon." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Highway 89 was the main route between Willowbrook and the county seat in Riverside, a road Daniel had driven hundreds of times. It wasn't particularly dangerous, just a winding mountain highway with guardrails and regular maintenance. "Is he—" I couldn't finish the question. "I'm sorry, Meredith." Daniel was pronounced dead at the scene. The paramedic said it would have been instantaneous. He wouldn't have suffered. I don't remember much about the conversation after that. Sheriff Wade Patterson said something about the investigation, about how they'd need to examine the vehicle and complete paperwork, about how Daniel's body would be taken to the county morgue in Riverside for an autopsy. My mind couldn't process the details. My youngest child, my brilliant, cautious son, who never took unnecessary risks, was gone. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and visitors. I called Victoria and Yellowstone, Marcus and Billings, and Isabella and Bozeman, struggling to find words to tell them their baby brother was dead. By noon, my cabin was full of neighbors and friends offering condolences, casseroles, and help with funeral arrangements. Sheriff Wade Patterson returned that afternoon with Daniel's personal items, his wallet, his keys, and his phone, which had somehow survived the crash with only a spiderweb of cracks across the screen. He also brought preliminary findings from the accident investigation. Near as we can tell, Daniel fell asleep at the wheel. No skid marks, no evidence of swerving or braking. His car just drifted off the road and rolled down into the canyon. These mountain highways can be dangerous late at night, especially for someone who's been working long hours.
After Patterson left, I sat alone in my kitchen holding Daniel's phone and trying to make sense of what had happened. My son had been acting strangely for weeks, talking about danger and warning me not to trust anyone. Now he was dead in what appeared to be a simple traffic accident. The timing felt too coincidental to be random. I tried to turn on Daniel's phone, but the screen remained black despite multiple attempts. The device was locked anyway, and I didn't know his passcode. I set it aside and focused on the overwhelming task of planning a funeral for a child who was supposed to outlive me by decades. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of arrangements and visitors. Victoria drove down from Yellowstone, taking charge of the logistics with the efficiency that made her an excellent ranger. Marcus and his family came from Billings, and Isabella arrived from Bozeman with her husband and their 2 young children, who couldn't understand why Grandma Meredith was crying all the time. We decided to hold the service at Willowbrook Community Church, the same small wooden building where Daniel had been baptized and confirmed. Pastor Hendricks, who had known our family for decades, agreed to officiate despite the short notice. The funeral was scheduled for Friday afternoon, giving time for Daniel's colleagues from Prometheus Digital Solutions to travel from Denver if they chose to attend. Wednesday evening, I received an unexpected visit from 2 men in dark suits who identified themselves as federal agents. Agent Morrison was tall and thin with prematurely gray hair, while Agent Rodriguez was shorter and stockier with intelligent dark eyes. They showed me badges and explained that they were investigating Daniel's death as part of a larger case involving cybersecurity breaches at government contractors. "Mrs. Blackwood, we're sorry for your loss," Agent Morrison said as we sat in my living room. "Your son was involved in some very important work for national security. We need to make sure his death wasn't connected to any ongoing investigations." "Are you saying someone might have killed Daniel?" I asked, my heart racing. "We're just being thorough," Agent Rodriguez replied smoothly. "Daniel had access to sensitive information that certain people might want to suppress. We need to examine his computers and work files to make sure nothing is missing." They spent 2 hours searching Daniel's apartment above Henley's hardware store, taking his desktop computer, several external hard drives, and boxes of documents related to his work with Prometheus Digital Solutions. They assured me it was routine and that everything would be returned after their investigation was complete. "Mrs. Blackwood, if anyone contacts you claiming to have information about Daniel's death, or if you find any of his personal effects that might be related to his work, please call us immediately." He handed me a business card with a phone number, but no office address. After they left, I studied the card and noticed something odd. The federal agency logo looked slightly wrong, as if it had been poorly photocopied. The more I thought about their visit, the more questions I had. Why would federal agents be interested in a simple traffic accident? And why had they seemed more interested in taking Daniel's equipment than in investigating his death? Thursday morning, I took Daniel's phone to Riverside Electronics, a small repair shop owned by Tommy Chen, a young man Daniel had mentored in computer programming. Tommy had always been grateful for Daniel's help and eager to return favors when possible. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm so sorry about Daniel," Tommy said when I explained what I needed. "He was like a big brother to me. Let me see what I can do about the phone." Tommy worked on the device for over an hour, carefully replacing the damaged screen and running diagnostics on the internal components. When he finally got it working, his expression changed from concentration to confusion. "This is weird," he said, staring at the phone's display. "The screen was cracked, but there's no other damage. And, Mrs. Blackwood, this phone has been receiving messages since the accident. Look!" He showed me the notification screen, which displayed dozens of missed calls and text messages that had arrived over the past 3 days. Most were from Daniel's colleagues at Prometheus Digital Solutions, offering condolences and asking about funeral arrangements. But there were also several messages from unknown numbers, and one that made my blood run cold. It was from a contact labeled Emergency Protocol and contained a single line of text: "Package delivered as requested. Awaiting Phase 2 confirmation." "Tommy, can you tell when this message was sent?" He checked the timestamp. "Yesterday at 11:47 p.m. Mrs. Blackwood, who would be sending messages to Daniel's phone after he died?" I didn't have an answer. I took the phone home and spent Thursday evening scrolling through Daniel's messages, calls, and emails, looking for clues about what he'd been involved in during his final weeks. Most of his communications were routine work-related exchanges, but I found several encrypted message threads that I couldn't open and phone calls to numbers that weren't in his contacts list. One email thread caught my attention. It was between Daniel and someone identified only as Lighthouse, and the messages were filled with technical jargon and coded language that I couldn't understand. The final message in the thread, sent just 2 days before Daniel's death, contained a single sentence that chilled me to the bone. "The wolves are at the door. Execute Protocol 7 immediately."
Protocol 7. Emergency Protocol. Whatever Daniel had been involved in, it was clearly more dangerous than cybersecurity consulting for a Denver-based company. Friday morning dawned gray and drizzly, appropriate weather for burying my youngest child. I dressed in my best black dress, the same one I'd worn to Theodore's funeral 5 years earlier, and prepared to say goodbye to Daniel in front of the entire town of Willowbrook. Willowbrook Community Church was packed beyond capacity for Daniel's funeral. Our small mountain town had a population of fewer than 4,000 people, but it seemed like every resident had come to pay their respects. Daniel had been well-liked despite his quiet nature, known for his kindness to elderly neighbors and his willingness to help anyone with computer problems. I sat in the front pew, flanked by my 3 surviving children and their families, holding Daniel's phone in my lap like a talisman. Victoria sat to my right, her ranger uniform crisp and professional, even in grief. Marcus was on my left with his wife Sarah and their 3 children, while Isabella and her family filled the rest of the row. Behind us, the church was filled with faces I'd known for decades. Sheriff Patterson sat with his wife in the 3rd row. Martha from the bakery dabbed at her eyes with tissues. Tommy Chen from the electronics shop sat with his parents, looking devastated. Even gruff old Henrik from the hardware store had cleaned up his overalls for the occasion. But scattered throughout the congregation were faces I didn't recognize. Men and women in dark, expensive clothing who didn't fit the casual mountain town aesthetic. They sat quietly, observing everything with the intense focus of people who were working rather than mourning. Pastor Hendricks delivered a beautiful service, speaking about Daniel's brilliance, his gentleness, and his love for the mountain wilderness that had shaped his childhood. Several of Daniel's friends shared memories of his kindness and humor. Tommy Chen gave a particularly moving tribute about how Daniel had encouraged his interest in computers and helped him start his own business. The service was simple and heartfelt, exactly what Daniel would have wanted. His casket sat at the front of the church, closed because the accident had been too severe for an open viewing. I tried to focus on the pastor's words about resurrection and eternal life, but my mind kept drifting to the encrypted messages on Daniel's phone and the strange federal agents who had searched his apartment. As Pastor Hendricks began the final prayer, I felt Daniel's phone vibrate in my lap. I glanced down and saw a notification appearing on the lock screen. New message. My heart stopped. I stared at the phone, certain I was hallucinating from grief and stress. People don't receive text messages from their dead children, especially not during their funeral services. But there it was, impossible and undeniable. A message notification on Daniel's phone arriving while his body lay in a casket 15 feet away. I quickly unlocked the phone using the passcode Tommy had helped me figure out, Daniel's birthday backwards, and opened the messaging app. The new message was from an unknown number, but the content made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the device. Mom, I'm alive, but if you tell anyone, we're both dead. Meet me at the old Blackwood mine tonight at midnight. Come alone and don't tell anyone. They're watching. I read the message 3 times, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The old Blackwood mine was abandoned property about 5 miles from my cabin, named after Theodore's grandfather, who had unsuccessfully prospected for silver in the 1920s. It had been sealed for decades, considered dangerous due to unstable tunnels and potential cave-ins. If Daniel was somehow alive, if this wasn't just the desperate fantasy of a grieving mother, that's where I would find the truth. I looked around the church frantically, wondering if someone was playing an unimaginably cruel joke. But everyone was focused on Pastor Hendricks' final blessing, heads bowed in prayer for my supposedly deceased son. The strangers in expensive clothes sat motionless, their faces revealing nothing. I slipped the phone back into my purse and tried to concentrate on the remaining moments of the service, but my thoughts were spinning with impossible questions. Could Daniel really be alive? Had he somehow faked his own death? And if so, why had he put his family through the agony of believing he was gone? After the service, we proceeded to Willowbrook Cemetery for the burial. The entire congregation followed, creating a procession of vehicles that stretched for nearly a mile along the mountain roads. At the gravesite, Pastor Hendricks said additional prayers while Daniel's casket was lowered into the ground next to Theodore's grave. I stood at the edge of the grave watching my son's supposed remains disappear into the earth, while his text message burned in my memory. Was there really a body in that casket, or was this all an elaborate deception? The funeral director had recommended a closed casket due to the severity of the accident, and I hadn't insisted on viewing Daniel's body because I couldn't bear to see my child broken and lifeless.
Now I wondered if my squeamishness had been manipulated as part of some larger plan. After the burial, the entire town seemed to migrate to my cabin for the traditional post-funeral gathering. My kitchen and living room filled with neighbors bringing food and sharing memories of Daniel. I moved through the crowd on autopilot, accepting condolences and making small talk, while my mind raced with questions about the message I'd received. Victoria noticed my distraction. "Mom, are you all right? You seem distant." "I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired." "Maybe you should lie down for a while. Marcus and I can handle the visitors." I nodded and retreated to my bedroom, closing the door and pulling Daniel's phone from my purse. I read the message again, confirming that I hadn't imagined it. "Mom, I'm alive, but if you tell anyone, we're both dead. Meet me at the old Blackwood mine tonight at midnight. Come alone, and don't tell anyone. They're watching." The phone number that sent the message wasn't in Daniel's contacts, but something about the phrasing felt authentic. Daniel had always called me Mom rather than Mother or Mama. He knew about the old mine because we'd hiked past it countless times during his childhood. and the warning about being watched aligned with his paranoid behavior during our last dinner together. But the implications were staggering. If Daniel was alive, then someone else had died in that car accident, or the whole thing had been staged. Either scenario suggested a level of deception and planning that seemed impossible for my quiet and gentle son to orchestrate. I spent the afternoon accepting condolences and trying to act like a normal grieving mother, while secretly planning for a midnight rendezvous with my supposedly dead child. The strangers from the funeral service had mingled with the crowd at my cabin, introducing themselves as colleagues from Prometheus Digital Solutions and offering vague condolences about Daniel's important work. One man in particular caught my attention, a silver-haired gentleman in an expensive suit who seemed more interested in observing my family than in expressing sympathy. He introduced himself as Mr. Stone from corporate, but when I asked specifically what Daniel had been working on, Stone's answers were evasive and unsatisfactory. Daniel was involved in some very sensitive projects, Stone explained. I'm afraid I can't discuss the details, but please know that his contributions to national security were significant. His loss is a blow to everyone who worked with him. What kind of projects? I pressed. Digital infrastructure protection, quite technical, I'm afraid. Daniel was one of our most talented analysts. Something about Stone's manner set off alarm bells in my mind. He spoke about Daniel in the present tense, as if my son were still alive, and his eyes seemed to catalog every detail of my cabin and family. When he left, Stone handed me a business card, identical to the one the supposed federal agents had given me. Same poorly photocopied logo, same lack of address. By 10 p.m., the last visitors had departed, and my family had settled in for the night. Victoria and Isabella were sharing the guest room, while Marcus and his family had set up air mattresses in the living room. The cabin was full of sleeping relatives who expected me to be safely tucked in my own bed, mourning my dead son. Instead, at 11:45 p.m., I crept out of the house and climbed into my old Ford pickup truck, careful not to start the engine until I was well down the mountain road. The old Blackwood mine was accessible only by a narrow dirt track that wound through dense pine forest, a route I hadn't traveled in years. My headlights carved through the darkness as I navigated the rutted path, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Either I was about to reunite with my supposedly dead son, or I was walking into a trap that could cost me my life. The mine entrance came into view at 11:58 p.m., a dark opening in the mountainside, sealed with rusted metal grating and warning signs about unstable conditions. I parked behind a cluster of pine trees and waited, watching for any sign of movement in the moonlit darkness. At exactly midnight, a figure emerged from behind the mine entrance, moving slowly and carefully across the rocky ground. Even in the dim light, I recognized the familiar silhouette immediately. It was Daniel. My son, my dead son, was walking toward my truck, very much alive, and looking more frightened than I ever seen him in his 32 years. I stumbled out of the driver's seat and ran towards him, my 70-year-old legs carrying me faster than they had since my youth. The uneven ground threatened to trip me, but I didn't care. All that mattered was reaching my child, touching him, confirming that this wasn't another grief-induced hallucination. "Daniel, oh my God! Daniel, you're alive!" I sobbed, throwing my arms around him and feeling his solid, warm, breathing body against mine. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I had to put you through this, but they were going to kill me, and probably you too, if they thought you knew anything." "Who was going to kill you? What are you talking about? Daniel, everyone thinks you're dead. I buried an empty coffin today." He pulled back and looked at me with eyes that seemed to age years in the past week. The carefree young man who had visited me for Sunday dinner was gone, replaced by someone who looked haunted and desperate. "Mom, I discovered something at work, something that people would kill to keep secret. I had to disappear before they made my death look like a real accident.
Standing in the shadow of that abandoned mine, holding my supposedly dead son under a canopy of Montana stars, I realized that everything I thought I knew about Daniel's quiet life had been a lie. Whatever he'd discovered, whatever had forced him to fake his own death, was dangerous enough that he'd let his own mother grieve for him rather than risk both our lives. Daniel, you have to tell me everything. What did you find? Who are they? And whose body did I bury today? He glanced around nervously, as if expecting armed men to emerge from the forest around us. It's bigger than you can imagine, Mom. Prometheus Digital Solutions isn't just a cybersecurity company. They're part of a network that's been stealing classified information and selling it to foreign governments. And I have proof that could send dozens of people to prison for treason. Then we go to the authorities. We tell Sheriff Patterson that you're alive and— No. Daniel grabbed my shoulders. Mom, you can't trust anyone in law enforcement. The corruption goes all the way up to the federal level. If word gets out that I'm alive, we'll both be dead within hours. But whose body? A homeless man from Denver who died of a drug overdose. They needed a body that matched my height and weight, someone whose death wouldn't be investigated too closely. The dental records and DNA will be switched if anyone asks for verification. I stared at my son, struggling to comprehend the level of planning and corruption required to fake a death so convincingly. Daniel, how long have you known about this conspiracy? I've been investigating for months. The evidence I gathered is hidden in a safe place, but, Mom, these people have resources and connections everywhere. They've been watching our family, listening to our phone calls, tracking our movements. The only reason I'm still alive is because they think I'm dead. As I stood there in the darkness, holding my son, who was supposed to be buried 6 feet underground, I realized that my quiet life in Willowbrook, Montana, was about to become more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. Daniel was alive, but we were both living on borrowed time. In part 2, I would later tell people who listened to my story, Daniel showed me evidence that would shake anyone's faith in the institutions we're supposed to trust. What I discovered about the conspiracy that reached from our small mountain town all the way to Washington, D.C., would force me to question everything I thought I knew about the country I loved, and put me on a collision course with killers who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But that night, all I could do was hold my son and try to understand how our simple mountain life had become entangled with forces powerful enough to fake deaths and manipulate federal investigations. The nightmare was just beginning. Mom, we can't stay here long, Daniel whispered, glancing nervously at the tree line surrounding the abandoned mine. They have surveillance equipment, tracking devices, ways of monitoring that you can't imagine. I've been living in caves and abandoned buildings for the past week, moving every few hours to stay ahead of them. I studied my son's face in the moonlight, noting details I'd missed in the initial shock of seeing him alive. Daniel had lost weight, his clothes were dirty and torn, and there was a haunted quality to his eyes that spoke of terror and sleepless nights. This wasn't the confident young man who'd visited me for Sunday dinner just weeks ago. Daniel, start from the beginning. What exactly did you find at Prometheus? He pulled a small waterproof bag from inside his jacket and withdrew what looked like a modified smartphone. 3 months ago, I was assigned to audit the security protocols for a new government contract. Routine stuff, or so I thought. The client was listed as the Department of Defense, but when I started digging into the data flows, I found something that didn't make sense. Daniel activated the device, and its screen cast an eerie blue glow in the darkness. Look at this. These are network traffic logs showing data transfers from classified government databases to servers in China, Russia, and North Korea. Terabytes of information flowing out every single day. I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of the technical data.
What kind of information? Everything, Mom. Military deployment schedules, weapons specifications, intelligence reports, diplomatic communications. Someone has been systematically stealing our country's most sensitive secrets and selling them to our enemies. My blood ran cold. And you think Prometheus is involved? Not just involved, they're running the entire operation. Prometheus was created as a front company to gain access to government contracts. Every cybersecurity service they provide includes backdoors that allow them to copy classified data. Daniel activated to another screen showing financial records. The money trail leads to shell companies and offshore banks, but I was able to trace some of the payments. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in payments from foreign intelligence services. But why would Americans do this? Why would they betray their own country? Money, Mom, more money than most people can imagine. The key players in this conspiracy are making tens of millions of dollars every year. They've convinced themselves that they're just businessmen providing information services. But what they're really doing is treason on a massive scale.
I thought about the well-dressed strangers at Daniel's funeral, their expensive clothes and watchful eyes. Who else is involved? How many people know about this? Daniel's expression grew even more grim. That's the terrifying part. The conspiracy reaches into federal law enforcement agencies, congressional offices, even parts of the military. They have people everywhere. Politicians, judges, police officers, federal agents. Anyone who gets too close to the truth either joins them or disappears. The federal agents who came to my house? Fake. They were Prometheus operatives sent to retrieve my computers and eliminate any evidence I might have left behind. Mom, those men weren't there to investigate my death. They were there to make sure it stayed permanent. I remembered Agent Morrison and Agent Rodriguez, their poorly photocopied badges and evasive answers. How did you find out about all this? By accident, initially. I noticed anomalies in the network traffic that didn't match the official project specifications. When I started investigating, I found encrypted communication channels that weren't supposed to exist. It took me weeks to break the encryption, but when I did, I discovered the whole operation. Daniel showed me another screen filled with decoded messages. These are communications between Prometheus executives and their foreign contacts. Look at this one from last month. Package delivery scheduled for October 15th. Expect payment of $50 million USD upon confirmation. That package was a complete copy of the Pentagon's new missile defense plans. The magnitude of what Daniel was telling me was overwhelming. My quiet son, who I thought spent his days protecting computers from hackers, had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened national security. Daniel, when did you realize you were in danger? About 3 weeks ago, when I started receiving death threats. At first, they were subtle, anonymous emails suggesting I should focus on other projects, phone calls where no one spoke, but I could hear breathing. Then they became more direct. He scrolled to a message that made my hands tremble. Mr. Blackwood, your curiosity about Project Lighthouse is noted and unwelcome. Cease your investigations immediately or face permanent consequences. Project Lighthouse? I asked. That's their code name for the overall operation. The systematic theft and sale of classified information to foreign governments. When I didn't back down, they decided I was too dangerous to live. So you faked your own death? Daniel nodded, his expression pained. I had help. From someone inside the conspiracy. Someone who grew a conscience and decided to help me escape instead of killing me. He provided the homeless man's body, arranged the car accident scene, and helped me disappear into the mountains. Who helped you? I can't tell you his name, Mom. The less you know about my allies, the safer you'll be. But he confirmed that there was a kill order out on me, set to look like an accident or suicide. I thought about the timing of Daniel's death, so soon after his paranoid warnings about not trusting anyone.
How long can you stay hidden? Not long. They're getting suspicious because they haven't found my evidence stash. Eventually, they'll figure out that I'm still alive and start hunting for me more aggressively. What evidence? What did you take? Daniel patted the waterproof bag. Everything. Financial records, communication logs, client lists, payment schedules, the names of everyone involved in the conspiracy. I have enough evidence to bring down the entire network and send dozens of people to prison for treason. Then we take it to the authorities. Surely there's someone in the government who isn't corrupt. Mom, you don't understand. This conspiracy includes people at the highest levels of law enforcement and government. If we approach the wrong person, we'll both be dead within hours. I stared at my son, trying to process the enormity of what he was telling me. Then what do we do? I've been working on a plan to expose everything publicly. Simultaneous releases to multiple news organizations, foreign allies, and government oversight committees create so much publicity that they can't silence everyone. How can I help? Daniel hesitated, clearly torn between wanting my assistance and protecting me from danger. There's something I need you to do, but it's risky. The evidence is hidden in multiple locations around Willowbrook, places only you and I know about. If something happens to me, someone needs to retrieve that evidence and get it to the right people. What kind of places? Remember the old treehouse Dad built for us kids and the big oak behind the cabin? There's a waterproof container hidden in the hollow trunk with financial records and client lists. And the fishing spot where we used to go when I was little, Willow Creek Falls. There's another cache hidden under the rocks behind the waterfall. I knew both locations intimately. Theodore had built that treehouse when our oldest children were young, and we'd spent countless summer afternoons at Willow Creek Falls, teaching our kids to fish and swim in the mountain pools. There are 5 hiding spots total. Each contains different pieces of the puzzle. If you have to retrieve them, you'll need to be extremely careful. They're watching you now, looking for any sign that I'm still alive or that you know something about my work. They're watching me? The funeral was full of Prometheus operatives. I was hidden in the hills above the cemetery with binoculars to watch who attended. At least a dozen people there had no legitimate reason to be at my service. I thought about the well-dressed strangers, their intense observation of my family, and probing questions about Daniel's work. The man who called himself Mr. Stone?
Richard Stone is Prometheus's head of security. He's personally responsible for eliminating people who threaten the operation. Mom, that man has killed at least 6 people in the past 2 years, all made to look like accidents or suicides. The casual way Daniel mentioned murder made me realize how far removed my mountain town life was from the world my son had been living in. How do you know all this? The evidence files include personnel records, operational reports, even recorded conversations about eliminating threats. Stone bragged to his superiors about his success rate in making deaths look natural. And he was in my house today, eating my food and pretending to mourn your death? That's how these people operate, Mom. They infiltrate, observe, and strike when you least expect it. Stone was there to gauge how much you knew and whether you posed a threat to their operation. I shuddered, thinking about how close I'd come to danger without realizing it. What happens now? I need another week to finalize my plans for exposing the conspiracy. During that time, you have to act completely normal. Grieve for your dead son, accept condolences from neighbors, and give no sign that anything has changed. How will I contact you? Daniel handed me a small device that looked like a pager. This is a secure communicator. It can't be traced or intercepted. If you need to reach me, send a message using the code we developed when I was a kid. I smiled, despite our dire circumstances. The alphabet substitution cipher you created for your secret club. Exactly. And Mom, if anyone suspicious approaches you,
anyone claiming to be federal agents, Prometheus employees, or even local law enforcement asking unusual questions, you activate the emergency signal by pressing these two buttons simultaneously. He showed me the device controls. That will warn me that you're in immediate danger, and I'll create a distraction to draw attention away from you. What kind of distraction? Let's just say that Prometheus has several facilities in the region that could experience unfortunate technical difficulties. I looked at my son with new eyes, realizing that the gentle, bookish young man I'd raised had become someone capable of fighting a shadow war against powerful enemies. Daniel, are you sure this is the only way? Mom, these people have been stealing our country's secrets for years. They've sold information that has gotten American soldiers killed overseas, compromised intelligence operations that took decades to develop, and enriched themselves while weakening national security. Someone has to stop them. But why does it have to be you? Because I'm the only one who has the complete picture. Other people suspected parts of the conspiracy, but I'm the first to gather comprehensive evidence of the entire operation. I thought about the risks Daniel was taking, the isolation he had endured while living as a fugitive in the mountains. What about after you expose everything? Even if you succeed, won't you still be in danger? Probably. But if I can get the evidence to enough people simultaneously, it will be harder for them to cover up or discredit. Once the truth is public, killing me would only confirm their guilt. Standing in the shadow of that abandoned mine, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my 70-year-old shoulders. My son was asking me to become part of a dangerous game that could cost both our lives. But the alternative was allowing traitors to continue selling our country's secrets to foreign enemies. I'll do whatever you need me to do, I said finally. Daniel hugged me tightly. I knew I could count on you. But, Mom, you have to promise me something. If this goes wrong, if I get caught or killed, you take the evidence and run. Don't try to be a hero. Just get the information to someone who can use it and disappear. Where would I go? Canada. You have distant relatives in British Columbia, and the Canadian government has been investigating Prometheus's connections to Chinese intelligence. They'd protect you in exchange for the evidence. The idea of fleeing to Canada like a fugitive seemed surreal, but everything about this conversation had already shattered my understanding of reality. How long do we have? A week, maybe 2 at most. After that, they'll either catch me or I'll have to execute the plan whether it's ready or not. Daniel checked his watch, an expensive model I didn't recognize. I have to go. Staying in one place too long is dangerous. Where will you sleep? How are you surviving in the mountains? I have supplies cached in various locations, and I know these mountains better than anyone, except maybe you. Growing up here, it was the best possible training for living as a fugitive. I thought about all the camping trips, hiking expeditions, and survival skills Theodore had taught our children. Those childhood adventures had prepared Daniel for a life I never could have imagined. Mom, when you go home tonight, act exactly like a grieving mother should. Cry, accept sympathy, and do nothing that might seem unusual. They're watching, and any deviation from expected behavior could expose us both. I understand.
The text message arrived at 2:47 p.m., just as the pastor was reading the final prayer over my son's casket. Mom, I'm alive, but if you tell anyone, we're both dead. I was holding Daniel's phone in my trembling hands, the same phone the police had returned to me with his personal effects, when this impossible message appeared on the screen. What I discovered about why my 32-year-old son had to fake his own death led me into a world of corruption, betrayal, and danger that I never knew existed, and the investigation that followed nearly cost me my life. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. At 70 years old, I thought I'd weathered every storm life could throw at me. My name is Meredith Blackwood, and I've spent my entire 7 decades in the mountain town of Willowbrook, Montana, population 3,847. The town sits nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are harder to keep than anywhere else in the world, or so I thought. I live in the same log cabin my late husband Theodore and I built with our own hands 45 years ago, back when we were young and foolish enough to think we could carve out a perfect life in the wilderness. The cabin sits on 12 acres of pine forest and wildflower meadows, with a view of Granite Peak that takes your breath away every sunrise. Theodore passed 5 years ago from a stroke, leaving me alone in our mountain sanctuary with nothing but memories and the wildlife that wander through my property like old friends. We raised 4 children in this house, watching them grow from toddlers who chased fireflies in our meadow to adults with their own complicated lives scattered across the country. My eldest, Victoria, became a forest ranger and moved to Yellowstone. Marcus followed his father's footsteps into carpentry and settled in Billings with his wife and 3 kids. Isabella married a rancher and lives just outside of Bozeman, close enough to visit but far enough to have her own life. And then there was Daniel, my baby, my youngest, at 32, and the one who could never quite find where he belonged in this world. Daniel was different from his siblings from the day he was born. While the others were content to explore the mountains, build tree forts, and live the simple life that Willowbrook offered, Daniel was fascinated by technology. By age 10, he was taking apart every electronic device in our house and somehow managing to put them back together better than before. When other kids were playing outside, Daniel was hunched over a computer, learning programming languages and hacking into systems just to see if he could. He was brilliant. The kind of brilliant that made his teachers shake their heads in amazement and worry in equal measure. Daniel graduated valedictorian from Willowbrook High School and earned a full scholarship to Montana State University, where he studied computer science and cybersecurity. While his classmates were partying and figuring out their majors, Daniel was already working part-time for tech companies, solving problems that stumped engineers with decades of experience. After college, Daniel moved back to Willowbrook, much to everyone's surprise. Most young people couldn't wait to escape our small town for the bright lights of bigger cities, but Daniel said he preferred the quiet. He rented a small apartment above Henley's hardware store on Main Street and started working remotely for various tech companies, specializing in cybersecurity and digital forensics. The work paid extremely well enough that Daniel could afford to live comfortably in our low-cost town while saving most of his income. He drove a modest Subaru Outback, dressed in flannel shirts and hiking boots like everyone else in Willowbrook, and spent his free time either visiting me at the cabin or hiking the mountain trails with his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, claiming he did his best thinking in nature. Daniel never married, though it wasn't for lack of interest from the few single women in town. He always said he was too busy with work to focus on relationships, but I suspected the real reason was that he'd never found anyone who understood his complex mind. He was gentle and kind, quick to help elderly neighbors with their computer problems or teach kids at the library how to code. But there was always something guarded about him, as if he carried secrets too heavy for casual conversation. For the past 3 years, Daniel had been working primarily for one company, Prometheus Digital Solutions, a cybersecurity firm based in Denver that specialized in protecting government databases and corporate networks. The work was classified, Daniel always told me, which meant he couldn't discuss details, even with family. When I asked what he did all day, he'd just smile and say he was keeping the bad guys out of places they don't belong. The money from Prometheus was good enough that Daniel had started talking about buying land outside town and building his own house. He'd even shown me architectural plans he'd been sketching, a modern cabin that would blend technology with the natural beauty of our mountain setting. We'd spent hours discussing where on the property he might build, whether to include solar panels, how to design the workspace where he could continue his cybersecurity work while living closer to the family he loved. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. Daniel had come to Sunday dinner as he did every week, bringing his usual contribution of store-bought pie from Martha's Bakery and his ever-present laptop bag. But something was different that evening. My son, who normally talked excitedly about his hiking adventures and the wildlife he had photographed during his mountain excursions, was quiet and distracted.
After providing the names and descriptions, Patterson hung up and looked at me seriously.
Meredith, I'm going to have this investigated. If someone impersonated federal agents to gain access to Daniel's property, that's a serious crime. Do you think they were trying to steal something? Could be. Your son worked with sensitive computer systems. Industrial espionage isn't uncommon in that field. I nodded, grateful that Patterson was taking the situation seriously, but terrified about what his investigation might uncover. If he started digging too deeply, he could expose Daniel's fake death or draw the attention of real Prometheus operatives. After Patterson left, I sat alone in my kitchen, studying the box of Daniel's belongings. Most items seemed routine: work notebooks, computer cables, software manuals. But tucked between two manila folders, I found something that made my hands tremble: a small key attached to a note in Daniel's handwriting. Mom, if anything happens to me, this opens safety deposit box 247 at First Mountain Bank in Riverside. Tell them you're settling my estate. The box contains my insurance policy. Love, D. Daniel had prepared for his own death or disappearance by leaving me access to additional evidence. The safety deposit box was 40 miles away in the county seat, far enough from Willowbrook that a trip there wouldn't seem unusual for someone handling a deceased relative's affairs. But first, I needed to check the treehouse Daniel had mentioned during our midnight meeting. That afternoon, while my family napped or rested in the cabin, I walked out to the old oak tree behind my property under the pretense of needing fresh air and solitude. The treehouse Theodore had built 30 years ago was still intact, weathered but sturdy, about 12 feet off the ground in the massive branches of a centuries-old oak. Climbing to the treehouse at 70 wasn't easy, but growing up on a mountain farm had kept me reasonably agile. The wooden ladder Theodore had built was still solid, and muscle memory from countless climbs to check on playing children guided me upward. The treehouse interior was exactly as I remembered: a simple wooden platform with walls on 3 sides and a slanted roof that had weathered decades of Montana storms. Childhood treasures still littered the corners: old comic books, a rusted toy truck, and carved initials from all 4 of my children. I found Daniel's hiding spot exactly where he'd described it: a hollow in the massive trunk, concealed by a piece of bark that had been carefully removed and replaced. Inside the hollow was a waterproof container about the size of a shoebox. My hands shook as I opened the container and found it packed with documents, USB drives, and photographs. The first item was a letter addressed to me in Daniel's careful handwriting. Mom, if you're reading this, then I'm either dead or deep in hiding. The evidence in this container represents 3 months of investigation into a conspiracy that threatens national security. Everything here has been verified through multiple sources. Trust no one with this information except the contacts I've listed in the red folder. Your loving son, Daniel. The red folder contained a list of names and contact information for journalists, congressional investigators, and foreign intelligence officials who Daniel believed could be trusted with the evidence. Each name was accompanied by detailed notes about their backgrounds, security clearances, and previous work exposing government corruption. The remaining documents were more shocking than I could have imagined. Financial records showed that Prometheus Digital Solutions had received over $200 million in payments from Chinese, Russian, and North Korean intelligence services over the past 3 years. The money flowed through a complex network of shell companies and offshore banks, but Daniel had painstakingly traced each transaction back to its source. Communication logs revealed the scope of information being sold: military deployment schedules from Afghanistan and Iraq, detailed specifications for new weapons systems, diplomatic cables discussing trade negotiations and foreign policy, intelligence reports on international terrorist organizations, even personal information about American agents working undercover overseas. But the most damning evidence was a series of recorded phone conversations between Prometheus executives and their foreign contacts. I listened to several recordings on a small digital player Daniel had included in the container, and each conversation made me feel sicker than the last. The Pentagon files will be available next Tuesday, said a voice identified as Richard Stone, the man who had attended Daniel's funeral. Payment should be deposited in the Cayman Islands account by Wednesday. What about the analyst who's been asking questions? Asked another voice with a slight accent. He's been handled. Permanent solution implemented yesterday. The authorities believe it was a traffic accident.
They were talking about Daniel's supposed death with the casual indifference of people discussing a business transaction. My son's life meant nothing to them beyond eliminating a threat to their profitable treason. Another recording was even more chilling. Senator Martinez is becoming problematic, Stone's voice said. She's asking too many questions about the defense contract anomalies. Can she be bought? Unlikely. She's one of those idealistic types who actually believes in patriotism. We may need to arrange an accident. How about family pressure? Does she have children? 2 daughters, both in college. Sometimes the threat of harm to family members is more effective than direct action.
I realized I was listening to people casually discussing the murder of a United States senator and threatening her children. The scope of the conspiracy was far beyond anything I'd imagined. But the most shocking document in the container was a list titled Prometheus Personnel, Government Positions. It contained the names and positions of dozens of people who worked for the conspiracy while holding official government jobs. The list included 3 FBI agents in the Counterintelligence Division, 2 judges on the Federal Court of Appeals, a deputy director at the CIA, 7 members of congressional staff from both political parties, multiple officers in military intelligence, and even 2 people working in the Department of Homeland Security. Daniel had uncovered a network of traitors that reached into every branch of government. No wonder he'd warned me not to trust anyone in law enforcement or federal agencies. The conspiracy had infiltrated the very institutions that were supposed to protect national security. As I sat in that treehouse, surrounded by evidence of betrayal on an unimaginable scale, I began to understand why Daniel had been willing to fake his own death rather than trust the normal channels of law enforcement. Any attempt to report this conspiracy through official channels would likely result in the evidence being buried and the whistleblower being eliminated. But there was more. At the bottom of the container, I found a USB drive labeled Insurance Policy, Final Resort. When I plugged it into the small laptop Daniel had hidden with the documents, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The drive contained detailed surveillance records showing that Prometheus had been watching my entire family for months. There were photographs of Victoria at her ranger station in Yellowstone, Marcus at his construction sites in Billings, and Isabella shopping with her children in Bozeman. They had floor plans of all our homes, daily schedule analyses, and even psychological profiles assessing our potential threat levels. The surveillance on me was particularly extensive. They had documented my daily routines, my grocery shopping patterns, my visits with neighbors, even my veterinary appointments for my elderly dog. They knew everything about my life, down to the smallest details. But the most disturbing part was a document titled Blackwood Family Elimination Priority Assessment. It ranked each family member by the level of threat they posed to the conspiracy. Daniel Blackwood, Priority 1, Immediate Elimination Required. Meredith Blackwood, Priority 2, Monitor for Knowledge of Son's Activities. Victoria Blackwood, Priority 3, Federal Employment Creates Security Risk. Marcus Blackwood, Priority 4, Low Threat, Civilian Occupation. Isabella Blackwood, Priority 4, Low Threat, Civilian Occupation. They had been planning to kill my entire family, if necessary, to protect their secrets. The next morning, I told my family I needed to drive to Riverside to handle some of Daniel's banking affairs. Victoria offered to come with me, but I insisted on going alone, claiming I needed time to process my grief privately. The 40-mile drive to Riverside gave me time to think about everything I'd discovered in the treehouse. My son wasn't just fighting to expose a conspiracy. He was fighting to protect our entire family from people who had already decided we might need to die. First Mountain Bank was a small regional institution that had served the area for over 50 years. I'd banked there occasionally when shopping in Riverside, so the staff knew me as a longtime local resident. When I explained that I was settling my deceased son's estate and needed access to his safety deposit box, the bank manager, Mrs. Chen, expressed appropriate condolences and asked for the key and death certificate. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Blackwood. Daniel was such a polite young man.
He opened this box about 6 months ago and visited it regularly. 6 months ago? Daniel had been planning for this situation far longer than I'd realized. Mrs. Chen led me to the vault and used her master key along with Daniel's key to open box 247. Inside was another waterproof container, larger than the one in the treehouse. "Take all the time you need," Mrs. Chen said, leaving me alone in the small viewing room. The container held the most comprehensive evidence collection I'd seen yet. Daniel had systematically documented every aspect of the Prometheus conspiracy, from its origins 5 years ago to detailed plans for future operations. The financial records were staggering. Prometheus had stolen and sold classified information worth an estimated $2 billion to foreign governments. The money had been used to buy political influence, corrupt government officials, and fund additional espionage operations. They were planning to expand their network into allied countries, selling American intelligence about British, Canadian, and Australian operations to hostile foreign powers. But what shocked me most was discovering that the conspiracy reached into my own community. A document titled Willowbrook Assets listed local people who had been recruited or compromised by Prometheus. Judge Harrison Cole, federal courthouse in Riverside, gambling debts used for leverage. Sheriff Deputy Tom Bradley being blackmailed over an extramarital affair. Mayor Patricia Hoffman, Willowbrook, receiving payments for zoning information. And Dr. Elizabeth Warren, Riverside Hospital, falsifying medical records as needed. Dr. Warren was the physician who had pronounced Daniel dead. She had been part of the conspiracy all along, helping to create the fake death certificate and medical reports that made Daniel's disappearance look like a genuine accident.
Even more disturbing was a file labeled Meredith Blackwood, Personal Profile. It contained details about my life that no stranger should know. Daily routines and shopping patterns, medical history including Theodore's cancer treatment, financial information including bank accounts and insurance policies, a psychological assessment noting strong family loyalty and protective maternal instincts, recommendations for leverage points if coercion became necessary. They had studied me like a specimen, looking for ways to manipulate or threaten me if I became a problem. The file even included contingency plans for making my death look like a natural heart attack or accidental fall. At the bottom of the container, I found Daniel's most devastating evidence, a complete copy of Prometheus's operational database, including client lists, payment schedules, and detailed records of every piece of classified information they had stolen and sold. The database showed that Prometheus had been responsible for security breaches that had cost American lives. Information they sold to foreign governments had been used to target American soldiers overseas, compromise intelligence operations, and identify undercover agents who were subsequently captured or killed. This wasn't just theft, it was treason that had directly resulted in the deaths of American military personnel and intelligence officers. But Daniel had also discovered something that could bring down the entire conspiracy. Evidence that Prometheus was planning to steal and sell information about a new American weapons system that could revolutionize warfare. The sale was scheduled for next month, with a price tag of $500 million to be split between Chinese and Russian intelligence services. If that sale went through, America's military advantage could be compromised for decades. Thousands of American lives could be lost in future conflicts because our enemies would know exactly how to counter our most advanced weapons. As I sat in that bank vault surrounded by evidence of betrayal that reached into the highest levels of government, I realized that Daniel's fight wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about preventing a catastrophe that could cost countless American lives and compromise national security for generations. When I returned to Willowbrook that afternoon, I immediately noticed something wrong. A black SUV with tinted windows was parked across the street from my cabin, and I could see the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat. The vehicle hadn't been there when I left for Riverside. I drove past my driveway and continued down the mountain road, checking my rearview mirror constantly. The SUV pulled out and began following me, maintaining a careful distance, but clearly tracking my movements. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I tried to think clearly.
Daniel had warned me that they would be watching for any sign that I knew about his survival or the conspiracy. My trip to the safety deposit box might have triggered their suspicions. I drove to Martha's Bakery in town, hoping that a public location would provide some safety. The SUV parked across the street while I went inside and bought a loaf of bread, acting like a grieving mother running errands. Martha greeted me with appropriate sympathy. "Meredith, honey, how are you holding up?" "I'm taking it one day at a time," I replied, glancing nervously out the window at the SUV. "That's all anyone can do. Your Daniel was such a sweet boy, always polite when he came in here." As Martha chatted about Daniel's childhood visits to the bakery, I noticed another unfamiliar face in the shop. A woman in expensive clothes who seemed more interested in observing me than in buying pastries. When I left the bakery, she followed me outside and got into a sedan that had been parked nearby. Now I had 2 vehicles following me. I drove home slowly, trying to appear calm while my mind raced with options. When I pulled into my driveway, both vehicles parked in positions that gave them clear views of my property. I was under active surveillance. Inside the cabin, my family was preparing dinner. Victoria noticed my tension immediately. "Mom, you look pale. Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired from the drive. Banking paperwork is exhausting." "Did you get everything sorted out with Daniel's accounts?" "Most of it. There are still a few loose ends to tie up." I tried to act normal during dinner, but my mind kept returning to the vehicles outside and the implications of being watched so closely. Had they followed me to the bank? Did they know about the safety deposit box? After dinner, I excused myself and went to my bedroom, where I retrieved the secure communicator Daniel had given me. Using the childhood cipher we'd developed, I sent him a message, "Wolves at the door. Package retrieved, but hunters gathering." His response came within minutes. "Stay calm, normal routine tomorrow, distraction planned for evening." I spent a sleepless night wondering what kind of distraction Daniel could create that would draw attention away from me. My son had become someone I barely recognized, a fugitive capable of conducting guerrilla warfare against a powerful conspiracy. The gentle, bookish young man who visited me for Sunday dinner had transformed into something far more dangerous and resourceful. The next morning brought a development that terrified me. Sheriff Patterson called to say that his investigation into the fake federal agents had uncovered some disturbing information. "She is Meredith. I need to ask you some questions about those men who claim to be federal agents. Can I come by this morning?" "Of course, Sheriff."
When Patterson arrived, he was accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize, a sharp-featured blonde in a business suit who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Collins from the FBI. "Mrs. Blackwood," Agent Collins said as they settled in my living room, "we need to discuss your son's death and the individuals who may have impersonated federal agents to gain access to his property." I studied her credentials carefully, remembering Daniel's warnings about trusting anyone claiming to be a federal agent. Her badge looked authentic, but so had the ones carried by Morrison and Rodriguez. "What can you tell me about the men who visited you?" Collins asked. I described the encounter again, watching both Patterson and Collins for reactions. Patterson seemed genuinely concerned, but something about Collins made me uneasy. Her questions were too detailed, too focused on what the fake agents might have taken from Daniel's apartment. "Mrs. Blackwood, did your son ever discuss his work with you? Did he mention any concerns about security breaches or unusual activities at his company?" Daniel rarely talked about work. He said most of it was classified. "But he never mentioned Prometheus Digital Solutions specifically? Never expressed concerns about their operations?" The question sent alarm bells ringing in my mind. How did Collins know about Prometheus unless she was part of the conspiracy? Sheriff Patterson had never mentioned the company name in his investigation. "I'm not familiar with that company," I lied. Collins exchanged a glance with Patterson. "Mrs. Blackwood, we have reason to believe that your son may have discovered illegal activities at his workplace. If he shared any information with you, it's crucial that you tell us. Your safety could depend on it." "My safety?"
The people involved in these illegal activities are extremely dangerous. They've already killed to protect their secrets, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone they perceive as a threat. I realized I was sitting across from either a legitimate FBI agent who was trying to protect me, or a Prometheus operative who was trying to determine how much I knew. The wrong answer could cost me my life. "Sheriff Patterson," I said carefully, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Collins frowned. "Mrs. Blackwood, this is a federal investigation. I need to hear anything you might know about." "I understand, but I'd like to speak with Sheriff Patterson first. He's known my family for 20 years. Patterson nodded. "Agent Collins, would you mind waiting outside for a few minutes?" Collins clearly didn't like being excluded, but she couldn't refuse without appearing suspicious. After she left, I turned to Patterson with a decision that could either save my life or doom us both. "Sheriff, I need to know something. Do you believe Agent Collins is legitimate?" Patterson looked surprised. "Why would you ask that?" "Because she knew about a company that Daniel worked for, a company you never mentioned in your investigation. And she's asking very specific questions about information Daniel might have shared with me." Patterson was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications. "Meredith, what aren't you telling me?" I made a calculated gamble. "Sheriff, if I tell you something that sounds unbelievable, will you hear me out before making any decisions?" "Of course." "Daniel discovered something at his company, something that cost him his life, and I don't think Agent Collins is who she claims to be." Patterson studied my face carefully. "Meredith, are you saying Daniel was murdered?" "I'm saying that my son uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into the federal government, and now I'm being watched by people who are willing to kill to protect their secrets." "What kind of evidence?" Before I could answer, we heard Colin's voice from the front porch, apparently talking on her phone. "She knows something. The banking activity yesterday confirms it. We need to accelerate the timeline." Patterson and I stared at each other in horror. Collins was reporting to someone about my trip to Riverside. She was definitely not a legitimate FBI agent. "Sheriff," I whispered, "we're both in danger now." Patterson's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon. "What do we do?" "I need to show you something that will prove everything I'm telling you, but we have to be extremely careful. These people have killed to protect their secrets, and they won't hesitate to kill again." Through the window, I could see Collins ending her phone call and preparing to come back inside. Whatever happened next would determine whether Sheriff Patterson became an ally in exposing the conspiracy or another victim of Prometheus's ruthless campaign to protect their secrets. As Collins' footsteps approached the front door, I realized that my quiet life in Willowbrook, Montana, was about to explode into violence that would test everything I'd learned in 70 years of mountain living. The investigation was about to become a fight for survival.
Collins's footsteps echoed on my wooden porch as she returned to the living room. Sheriff Patterson and I exchanged a loaded glance. We both knew the next few minutes would determine whether we lived or died. "Sorry about that call," Collins said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Federal bureaucracy never sleeps." "Of course," I replied, watching her carefully. "Sheriff Patterson and I were just discussing Daniel's work schedule." Collins leaned forward with obvious interest. "What about his work schedule?" "I remember that he mentioned working late several times before his death. He seemed worried about security issues at his company." "What kind of security issues?" Collins's voice sharpened dangerously. "He mentioned data that wasn't supposed to be accessible to certain employees." "Mrs. Blackwood, did Daniel save any files related to these concerns? Any documents that might be hidden somewhere?" The question confirmed our suspicions. Collins wasn't investigating anything. She was trying to locate Daniel's evidence. "Agent Collins, Purasit, could you see your credentials again?" Collins handed over her badge with slight hesitation. Patterson examined it carefully, his expression growing serious.
The badge number doesn't match current FBI formats, and these security features look unusual. Collins's friendly demeanor evaporated instantly. Sheriff, I don't appreciate having my credentials questioned. And I don't appreciate fake federal agents in my jurisdiction. The tension became electric. Collins's hand moved toward her jacket, and Patterson's moved toward his gun. Agent Collins, I said carefully, perhaps you could call your supervisor to verify your assignment. That won't be necessary, Collins replied coldly. Mrs. Blackwood, you're coming with me for additional questioning. This investigation has revealed that your son was selling classified data to foreign agents. That's a lie, Sheriff Patterson said, drawing his weapon. Ma'am, keep your hands visible. Collins smiled coldly. Sheriff, you have no idea what you are interfering with. Walk away now and you might live to see retirement. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Suddenly, an explosion shook the entire cabin. Through the windows, I could see the black SUV that had been watching my house burst into flames. Collins spun toward the noise, and Patterson tackled her to the ground. More explosions echoed through the valley. Daniel's promised distraction was more spectacular than I had imagined. As Patterson struggled to handcuff Collins, she broke free and sprinted toward the back door. Patterson fired a warning shot, but she was already running into the forest. Should we chase her? I asked. No, let's secure the area. 20 minutes later, as smoke rose from multiple locations around Willowbrook, a familiar figure emerged from the tree line behind my cabin. It was Daniel, carrying a backpack and moving with the confident stride of someone who had completed a successful mission. Mom, Sheriff Patterson, he called out. We need to move quickly. I've neutralized their surveillance network, but reinforcements will arrive soon. Sheriff Patterson stared at Daniel in amazement. Son, everyone thinks you're dead. That was the point. Sheriff, my mother showed you the evidence? Enough to know that you've uncovered something massive. Daniel led us quickly to a Subaru, hidden behind my barn. We're going to the old mining camp in Bear Valley. I have everything set up there for the final phase. During the 30-minute drive through mountain roads, Daniel explained his plan. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, every major news organization in the country will simultaneously receive complete evidence packages, financial records, communication logs, recordings of Prometheus executives discussing murder, everything. What about protection? Patterson asked. That's where you come in, Sheriff. I need someone in law enforcement I can trust to coordinate with federal agencies that aren't compromised. We arrived at what looked like an abandoned mining camp, but I could see that Daniel had transformed it into a sophisticated operations center. Solar panels powered computer equipment, and communication arrays connected him to the outside world. Daniel, how long have you been planning this? 6 months, Mom. Ever since I discovered the conspiracy, I've been preparing for the possibility that I'd need to disappear completely. He showed us the evidence he'd compiled, thousands of documents proving that Prometheus Digital Solutions had stolen classified information worth over $2 billion and sold it to Chinese, Russian, and North Korean intelligence agencies. The most damning evidence, Daniel explained, is this recording of Richard Stone discussing the planned assassination of Senator Martinez because she was asking too many questions about defense contract anomalies. We listened to Stone's voice casually discussing murder. She's one of those idealistic types who believes in patriotism. We may need to arrange an accident. Patterson was visibly shaken. How many people are involved in this conspiracy? Dozens in key positions. FBI agents, federal judges, congressional staff, military officers. They've infiltrated every level of government. That evening, Daniel made final preparations for what he called Operation Lighthouse, the simultaneous release of evidence that would expose the entire conspiracy. At exactly 9 a.m. Eastern Time, he explained, automated systems will send evidence packages to 847 recipients, news organizations, foreign intelligence services, congressional committees, international human rights organizations, everyone who needs to know the truth. What happens after that? I asked.
Phase 2, live testimony to congressional investigators and cooperation with federal agencies we can trust. Phase 3, survival, because everyone involved will want us dead.
Patterson had been coordinating with his most trusted deputies. I've arranged protection through the Montana State Police and contacted the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Unit. They're not on your list of compromised agencies. As midnight approached, Daniel activated his transmission systems. Mom, in 9 hours, the truth about this conspiracy will be public knowledge. Whatever happens after that, we'll face it together. I watched my son, no longer the quiet computer specialist I thought I knew, but a determined whistleblower who had risked everything to expose treason, as he made final checks on equipment that would change American history. At 9 a.m. Eastern Time on October 15th, Daniel's automated systems executed the largest intelligence leak in American history. Within minutes, news organizations across the country were reporting on the Prometheus conspiracy. We watched the coverage from Daniel's command center, monitoring news feeds from around the world. CNN led with, "Massive government conspiracy exposed." The BBC reported, "American intelligence sold to foreign enemies." Even Chinese state media acknowledged receiving evidence of the conspiracy. By noon, the FBI had arrested Richard Stone and 12 other Prometheus executives. The Department of Justice announced the formation of a special task force to investigate what they called the most serious breach of national security in decades. Senator Martinez, whose assassination had been planned by the conspiracy, held a press conference demanding immediate congressional hearings. The evidence released this morning shows that foreign enemies have been purchasing our nation's most sensitive secrets through a network of traders operating at the highest levels of government. Daniel monitored law enforcement communications throughout the day. They've arrested 47 people so far. Financial assets are being frozen. The conspiracy is collapsing faster than I expected. But our relief was tempered by reality. As Patterson warned, some of these people will never be caught. They've had years to establish escape routes and new identities. 6 months later, I sat in a congressional hearing room watching Daniel testify before the House Intelligence Committee. The quiet young man who had once visited me for Sunday dinners was now a key witness in the largest espionage prosecution in American history. Mr. Blackwood, your courage in exposing this conspiracy has prevented incalculable damage to national security. The committee thanks you for your service to your country. The Prometheus trials would continue for 2 years. Richard Stone received life in prison without parole. 43 other conspirators were convicted of treason, espionage, or related crimes. The financial investigation recovered over $800 million in stolen assets. More importantly, the security reforms prompted by Daniel's revelations prevented future breaches of this magnitude. New oversight procedures, enhanced background checks, and improved counterintelligence protocols made it much harder for foreign enemies to infiltrate American institutions. Daniel entered the Federal Witness Protection Program, but we stayed in contact through secure channels. He eventually emerged from hiding to work with the Department of Homeland Security, using his skills to protect the country he had risked everything to defend. I rebuilt my life in a new location, surrounded by family and friends who finally knew the truth about why my son had to fake his own death rather than allow traders to continue selling our country's secrets to foreign enemies. The price of exposing the truth was high. We lost our quiet mountain life and spent years looking over our shoulders. But we saved countless American lives by preventing the sale of classified information that would have given our enemies devastating advantages in future conflicts. Sometimes the greatest act of love for your family is protecting the country that keeps them free. If you're watching this story and wondering whether you'd have the courage to do what Daniel did, remember that heroes aren't born. They're ordinary people who choose to act when they discover extraordinary evil. Comment below with your city and tell me, would you risk everything to expose the truth, even if it meant losing the life you'd built? The answer to that question determines whether freedom survives or dies in darkness. Thank you for following this journey from beginning to end. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that remind us that truth, however dangerous, is always worth fighting for.